Welcome, listeners, to the Fantasy Animation podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
We are back looking through the archive of posts, and we picked
I love an archive.
I love an you're a lapsed historian, that's why. This is our opportunity to go back through and listen to some of our episodes and give you the chance to maybe listen to an episode that you didn't catch first time around. We've selected this time a relatively-ish early one, but something that does something slightly different. I think it's one of our earliest ones where we went sort of on tour, I think.
Yeah, is this our first live episode?
I think it might be episode 38. So it comes live. Was recorded live at the Cinema Museum in Kennington, South London.
Yeah, so we did a partnership with them just before COVID, where we did a screening series. They were very, very kind to host it, and it involved some of these Q&As. Yep. Some of them we just did live on the thing, but we thought we'd record a couple when we were planning the series, and this was definitely one of them. So yeah, it's sort of, and the audience had loads of questions and loads of comments, and we were joined, of course, by Dr Caroline Ruddell, who knows more about this film than we did. Yep. Luckily, so she could help us, and we screened the movie and all that sort of stuff.
It was a brilliant event, and thanks to Caroline. So Caroline wrote a chapter for the Fantasy Animation book. Because there is such a thing before the podcast, on the kind of context surrounding Reiniger's Prince Achmed, but also how it's sort of the role of fantasy in negotiating Weimar Germany in this particular period. So she was very kind to kind of come along, and after the film, we had an extended Q&A. So you'll hear us chatting about the film, Caroline giving us the benefit of her expertise, and then a number of questions that are directed at us and at the film, where we kind of think through some of the paradigms, I guess, that surround a very influential film by a filmmaker that definitely there's not as much written on as there should be.
I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, thank you everybody for sticking around for this Q&A and live podcast recording. There'll be a roaming mic later on, so we'll leave space at the end for sort of questions. As we said in the introduction, I work in animation largely, and Alex is a sort of history, is interested in the history and theory of fantasy, and so it's a real pleasure for us to kind of come together and talk about The Adventures of Prince Achmed, a film that we'd thought about recording for the podcast for a while, and it's something that I think we wanted to do. And we sort of held out because we wanted to involve Caroline. So this seems a really good chance to talk to her a little bit about how she came to the film, some of the work that she's done, and then we sort of gave, in our email exchanges beforehand, a sort of rundown of key areas that we might touch on. So I know that Caroline's very interested in kind of craft and the handmade, and this bigger question perhaps of where we place and situate and cite Reiniger. And it's great that there are so many, I know, kind of fans of Reiniger and animation scholars in the room as well, people that research Reiniger. So hopefully once we've spoken to Caroline for a bit and got her thoughts on the film, we can open it out for questions. And so we'd really like to hear your thoughts on the screening, of course, and if there's anything that you'd like to kind of pose to us. But to kick things off, I know Caroline's work, and I kind of came to, and I know the kind of stuff that she writes on, and so I'm interested in how she came to Reiniger, and particularly this film, as a kind of focus for her. She's written on doppelgangers, but I know her largely through her work on animation. So I guess as a sort of starter for 10, I'm really interested in where you were kind of coming from for the. How did you discover Reiniger and ultimately this film?
Okay, thank you. Is that working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. It's a funny story because I have a very sort of classic film studies background, really, and the first book that I wrote was about doppelgangers, as Chris has just alluded to. So I was very interested in kind of identity and shadow selves on screen and what's kind of going on there. And I think sort of shortly after I'd finished that. I read Esther Leslie's Flatlands?
Hollywood Flatlands, yeah.
And she was writing about Reiniger, and it sparked a memory of seeing. I'd seen some still images of Reiniger stuff, and I this is a slightly odd link, I suppose, but. So there were two things. I was interested in kind of shadow selves on screen, and this is a very different kind of shadow world to the sort of the doppelganger stuff I was looking at, which is all about doubles and split identities and that kind of thing. But something in my mind sort of went there. And I really like Esther Leslie's stuff generally, and her writing about Reiniger. I just became very interested about this question of 1923, and I was sort of looking at animation anyway, and just this idea that sort of something that's seen as a bit trivial, I think, and I say that's obviously highly problematic, but, you know, cartoons and animation is often seen as sort of fairly lightweight and trivial, or children's stuff, and this film just strikes me as very important. So I've spent quite a long time sort of since then trying to work through some of those issues, because I think it's a very important film for lots of reasons. It's very important because of her. Lotte Reiniger is a very important figure in our animated history and our film history, and I don't think she's been given the sort of her dues as she should have been. And lots of people write about her and say, "Oh, isn't she fantastic?" And then that's kind of it.
So she's sort of like a footnote or a bullet point or a thing that happened in that period, and then we went on to Disney. Is that the narrative?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's it. So, you know, there is a reason why you know, people often think Snow White is the first animated film. There's a reason why people think Disney. Lots of people think Disney invented the multiplane camera. Chris Pallant sat at the back there, acknowledges Lotte Reiniger in his book. So that's one of the few sources that actually does do that, because she was very pioneering, and because of how she was working, you know, in a very independent kind of fashion. You know, she's not really been given her dues that she should have been.
You said ominously there is a reason why. What is that reason, do you think, then, that she hasn't been given the acknowledgement that she deserves? Is it to do with her subject matter, or is it to do with sort of her place in history? I wondered if you could say more about that.
Yeah, it's to do with a number of things. One is the fact that she's a woman working outside of the mainstream kind of industry. So generally, again, I mean, Bella's sitting over there. She can say a lot more about this.
This is great. This is like physical referencing. This
Hello.
is good.
You know, women are often...
You should always cite your sources.
Yes. Yeah.
One there and one there.
You can see them.
Yeah, they're in the room. Yeah, you know, there is sort of some tradition of women in animation working outside of the industry, sort of in more kind of, you know, artisanal practices, and I think Reiniger has been part of that kind of tradition. So, you know, Paul Wells writes quite problematically about her in terms of sort of, you know, stuff to do with a feminine aesthetic, which is quite a difficult and problematic term. So I think there's that. I think the fact that she does fairy tales, which was very much aligned with children's culture. So what's really interesting about the silhouette format is that it started out as portraits. Before there was photography, before anything like that existed, people used silhouettes and I'm sure you've seen examples of this, to create silhouettes of people as a form of portraiture. But it then, once photography became, you know, much more standard in terms of documenting the, you know, the indexical reel, silhouette stuff moves into kind of the realm of children's culture and fairy tale, and is largely taken less seriously. So if you look back at sort of trade press stuff on Lotte Reiniger's work, it's you know, what's played up is sort of the fairy tale qualities, that it's kind of children's stuff, that she is in some way herself kind of magic or wizard, you know, somehow magic to these films out of nowhere. She's not really taken that seriously as a sort of technical pioneer, which is what she was. Yeah.
So, because I was just thinking then, given the centrality of fantasy and fairy tales, I guess I have a question for Alex, which is really, does Lotte Reiniger appear... I mean, we talk about lots of figures that traverse these categories, or these dual histories, or these root and branch histories of fantasy and animation, which obviously we're trying to suggest or think about as a lot more knotted. And so I wondered whether, given what Caroline's saying in terms of the centrality and the focus on fairy tale, and the fact that she's often positioned in this 20s period as somebody in animation history that happened, and this was a thing, and the film was released, and this was wonderful, and then Disney came along and sort of did loads and loads of exciting things. Does Reiniger appear in histories of fantasy film, fantasy cinema? Is she similarly occluded or marginalised?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think she does appear, but I think she's part of a sort of broader problem in fantasy writing, which is they often take animation as the tool to make the fantasy come to life. So animation often isn't given the sort of artistic or imaginative credit it often deserves. These animators are rarely sort of seen as fantasists in their own right, but as people or sort of artisans that bring another vision to life. So she's very much seen as a sort of an adapter of folk stories and a pioneering adapter. But and it's interesting you were saying that her technical expertise is often played down, because actually I would argue that probably isn't true in fantasy scholarship or fantasy history. It's often that's played up, if anything. But I wanted to sort of actually draw on what you were saying about sort of children's literature and this idea of folk story and linking to Reiniger's gender. In that I think it's Marina Warner who makes this point. Folk stories are as much a sort of women's literature as they are coded as children's literature very often. The household tale, the domestic sphere in which folk stories are engaged with. So I find it fascinating that that someone so engaged in sort of left-wing politics and the avant-garde in the 20s would find folk stories a useful vehicle for expression. Do we know a little bit more about sort of why she turned to of all things, a sort of, an oral history, the 1001 Nights, of all the sort of things for inspiration, and what the sort of political act she was trying to commit during that period was, if any?
There's some number of interesting points in there. So one thing I would say is that Reiniger, to my knowledge, was never overtly political about anything. The one kind of main political act she did do was leave Germany during the rise of the Nazis, and that was because her and her husband did that out of solidarity for Jewish friends. They were not themselves being persecuted. So that's the one kind of political act that, if you can call it a political act. Otherwise, she's very kind of depoliticized, which, again, I find really interesting. But to come to your point about fairy tale and folklore, and there is obviously a huge tradition of women reclaiming that. Marina Warner is key, as was Angela Carter, although Angela Carter also came up against some criticism in terms of how she approached her sort of reappropriation of fairy tale. I think what I'd say about Reiniger is that she doesn't seem to be doing anything of that description. So I'm sure you'll be aware, watching the film, that it's quite problematic in its representation of many identities.
I've got race question mark written on my notes. We might get to that in a second.
Yeah. So yes, I don't think she was doing anything overtly political with the form of fairy tale as a kind of form of women's expression in the way that other people have done. She was. I've never read anything that suggests that she was particularly overtly political about anything, which is interesting, and I find problematic because it feeds into the narrative of her kind of doing sort of trivial stuff while her male collaborators are doing this important avant-garde political work. So that's a big question, which I'm not sure I have a particularly decent answer to, but it's something that is a big question mark over her, I think.
I mean, I was going to say, because you mentioned the artisanal, and obviously I know that you're interested in craft and handmade. So some of that triviality, because I think obviously we've seen how ornate this work is, and so is part of the triviality then these sort of quote unquote industrial or these personal processes in which she is coded and framed within a particular kind of workspace. And ultimately the resulting kind of pretty work. So I've heard you speak previously about criticisms or Reiniger's connection to these kinds of categories: craft, handmade, and this pretty feminine aesthetic. Is that where the triviality kind of comes in?
Yes, and I do stress that that's deeply problematic. So
it's a very kind way of saying it. I think it's a very academic way of saying it. Deeply problematic.
Yeah.
It's
Unpack.
stupid.
Yeah, so one of I guess the other thing to come back to your very first question, the other thing that interested me about Reiniger is that I'm very interested in handmade work, and that's because it's gendered. essentially. So craft-based work has been gendered for a long time, since we had a rather strange division between the arts and the crafts, and arts kind of ended up as this sort of realm of male genius, and crafts were often aligned, and this is not my argument, this has been argued by many people before me. Crafts became aligned with women, with domesticity, things that you can do in the home, with tools that you have at your disposal, and Reiniger fits very much into that kind of category. So she often spoke or did workshops on how to make your own silhouette films, and she would say, all you need is your kitchen table and your kitchen scissors, and this sort of emphasis on sort of domestic again, to cite Bella, I mean, Bella's been looking at this in more detail, and kind of women's kind of labour and where women work and where they kind of fit work in, and often working outside of the mainstream. And that's got all kinds of questions attached to it. Reiniger is interesting in that respect. I would say that lately, interestingly, craft is probably held up as very important. So I think, to kind of, this is kind of broad strokes, but there's been a bit of a kind of backlash against things like CGI and computer generated imagery, and there's sort of a little bit of a holding up of craft as sort of authentic, and that's also very problematic. So those kind of boundaries have shifted, I think, in quite interesting ways. But to come back to your point about the pretty, yes. So Reiniger's work is obviously very ornamental, as you've seen, and so some of the work I've done is looking at that kind of aesthetic, because what's happened with Reiniger, and this is one of the problems with how people have approached her work, is they've become completely waylaid by how her work looks, because it is so arresting. It's very ornamental, it's very unique, and it is very beautiful to look at. So what's kind of been ignored is her kind of context and the other stuff that's going on around her work, and what comes out very, very clearly in the kind of, particularly the trade press around her work, is that it's pretty. It's pretty work, and that leads us into a whole kind of very difficult area. So, I would follow Rosalind Gout's argument that the idea of the pretty aesthetic is a deeply gendered one, and it's also about cultural value, where we have less value attached to work that is deemed to be kind of pretty and feminine and apolitical.
And just to be clear, so these are criticisms of her work that are happening at the time and
implied,
and are still largely upheld today, because there seems to be, I wouldn't say that there's some sort of full weight kind of recovery of her work, but certainly you seem to be implying or suggesting that there are certain shifts in the way, given this kind of technological focus that you suggested, that there is a quote-unquote backlash against pristine illusionism of computer graphics and things like this, which perhaps precipitates a broader question or investment in craft, which then perhaps allows us to then recover? So I'm just interested in whether there is a sort of shift here, that we are now thinking about her in lots of new and exciting and interesting and unproblematic ways.
I think we can do, which is partly what I'm trying to do, although it's not just about Reiniger. So I think there has been a shift. I think for a long time craft has been hierarchically less valued than art, and these are all really, I understand that I'm saying, these are all really problematic distinctions, and I'm kind of using broad strokes to talk about them, but that has been the case for quite a long time. And I think more recently craft has had a resurgence in terms of the sort of the cultural value that we attach to it, and we can see this commercially. So I'm ever amused by the sort of increasing signs for craft beer down high streets, and if anyone's been past a Costa recently, there's signs for handcrafted coffee made in Costa, which is just ridiculous.
Problematic.
Let's go back to that term. But so there's been a resurgence, and it's kind of emblemised by stuff like Wallace and Gromit. We love the idea that it's taken such a long time for something to be made and that we can see thumbprints in it. And these are all really difficult distinctions because, you know, if you talk to any animator, they will use craft-based handmade methods and they will use digital methods, computers, you know, whatever, all kinds of software, etc. And they will not necessarily see value, a higher value attached to either of those processes. They use those processes in order to make what they want to make. So I think these are quite problematic sort of assumptions about cultural value and what we do value. But I do think it's the case that lately this idea of craft and things being handmade has taken hold a little bit in culture across various kind of industries, actually, and we're quite attached to this idea, and it is to do with kind of the authentic, problematically. So yes, I think we can recover Reiniger looking at those kind of issues. I think what we can't do is rewrite history, and what we can't ignore is that when her work has been released and when she's had anniversaries and all these kinds of things, you know, all the stuff that's written about her is in those terms. It's about the pretty, it's about magic, and it's about children's culture. Or it's about her being crafty, which is kind of the magic thing as well. She's crafty in two ways. She's crafty because she hand makes her stuff, and she's crafty because, you know, she's probably not skilled enough to actually have made these films, so she's somehow magicked them out of somewhere. So I think we can't ignore that history, but what we can do is write about her differently now, and that is a way of reclaiming her in the canon, I think.
So I guess as a final note of discussion before we open it up to questions, what could we say more about what we should be celebrating? I think we've said quite a lot about the ways in which her work is described that we would not agree with. Mm-hmm. Perhaps we could, you know, end on a note of positivity and talk about what is something we should value in her work that perhaps is often unvalued in it. I mean, we've talked a little bit about a few things, but for me, the sense of the sense of the metamorphic, I think, which is such a powerful sort of force to get across in fantasy filmmaking, and somehow with these sort of little paper puppets, there's something so malleable and flexible about every single figure and every single form, and that sort of odd paradox is so striking on screen. So that's just one thing for me, at least, that I spotted on this viewing. What else could we say that's that we should be saying about her work more, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think people have been so caught up with the general aesthetic of her work, they actually haven't dug into the, a huge sort of amount of metamorphosis, which is kind of key to animation as well. There's lots of that kind of actual stuff about representation that hasn't really been covered in her work. And yeah, I mean, your race question mark is there's some problems clearly there as well. So there's that. The other thing that hasn't properly been charted, and which I am determined to do, is her development of the table, and the fact that Disney pretty much replicated it 10 years later. So we do have some sources that refer to that. I mentioned Chris's source, and also there are some publications attached to German museums that allude to this as well. But no one's properly charted that kind of technological development there. So I think things like that could be properly uncovered.
Yeah, no, I think her connection, because I was thinking about the technological aspects and where this comes within animation history, and also the point about the political, because I know that you've written about, and you gestured to this in your introduction actually, that the film, because we perhaps become preoccupied with its aesthetic and its style and the fact that it's quite ornate and decorative, that perhaps, or I don't know whether that veils a sort of, that this film is absolutely about the time that it's written rather than a distraction from it, which is obviously when we've talked about fantasy films previously, the role of allegory and metaphor and things like this. So should we be reading Reiniger in a kind of more political situated sense in the context of Weimar Germany? Is that a way in as well to push against a sort of surface level viewing of the decorative?
just to give you time to answer that, the other thing we've also talked about on this is the danger of reading fantasy allegorically, and that it kind of strips, another problematic term, it strips the magic away a little bit, right? There's this, we talk about power relationships and reclaiming. Quite often people reclaim fantasy fiction by going, oh, don't worry, it isn't really a fantasy, it's actually a coded metaphor for something very deeply socially real. So actually it's okay, it's a proper
legitimate
thing. Yeah. So there's also a danger of sort of doing that to it. So I don't know where you would sit on that.
Yeah, I find this question quite hard to answer, and I grappled with it in my chapter for your book, as you know.
Yeah, but we're recording this one.
Yes, that's true. I think we can read the film metaphorically. I strongly suspect was not her intention, actually, given the rest of the body of her work. So you can't really look at Reiniger's work as a whole, and given that she made films for a long time, with a 10-year gap when her husband died. So we can chart her work through most of her adult life, and her thematic preoccupations are the same. So it's very difficult to place her films within the kind of political and social context of the time, really. I think we can take Esther Leslie's argument that the film is entirely to do with 1923, if that's how we want to read it. But I guess it comes down to a question of what importance we place on intent. And the nice thing about fantasy, and I do take your point that we have to be very careful about legitimizing fantasy by grounding it in some sense of the real. That there is also an argument that she made this film in 1923 because it would be cathartic and escapist, and and we can see that in other areas of the film industry throughout history. So, yeah, I don't have an answer to that question. I wish that I could talk to her about it, but...
that'd be great, yeah.
Yeah.
Fantasy animation, we need a time machine. I'm not sure how we create one of those. But yeah, absolutely. I think perhaps we could also say that, why can't we see catharsis as a political act? We somehow, we are very hard on ourselves when we think about what counts as socially engaged activities. I think switching off or escaping, or all these words that we often see as bad aesthetically, are actually really important restorative activities that we need to sort of exist in society. So I think that's true too. Should we? We've got a roaming mic in the audience. Let's take some questions from the audience. So please do shoot your hand up, or a comment, or a question, or anything that you'd like to contribute. We can riff. We're good at that. Yeah, sorry, if you could just wait for the microphone, otherwise you won't get your starring role. And I'll have to repeat it.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We've got one at the back, and then we've got one at the front in a second, yes.
Long-time listener, first-time speaker. I think if you're looking for positive things to reclaim, what about the story? I mean, the story is really funny, it's really sexy, there's lots of action going on. As you've talked about at length and really intelligently, there's so much to say about the look of it, the aesthetic of it, but I mean, the story's super tight. It's kind of, Michael Bay will be proud of this, and to the way it kind of moves from action to action to action. And I don't think that's really part of the general conversation, that I encounter. It's always about that kind of the surface discourse. So yeah, I would say let's reclaim the story as well.
Well, I don't know whether this is true, and you'll know more about the kind of process of it, but is that narrative economy rooted in the practice and the labour, i.e. certain kind of limitations, i.e. the figures impose a certain degree of limitation, so actually every move has to be precise and loaded and be able to communicate certain actions quite quickly and quite economically, and so is the relatively short-ish running time connected to that sort of interplay between limitation and creativity? Is there something in that tightness of narrative?
Yeah, so I think with any film of this nature, and of course they're quite rare, you do have to be very, you have to plan ahead. So if you see her, the way she planned stuff was really interesting, because it was like storyboarding, but she would draw in the movements and the music as well. So she worked very much to music. So you get this very this very kind of tight storytelling, and the film is told in acts. So if you watch it on YouTube, you can watch it in each act, and it's very structured. Yeah. So Chris, you're right. It's an interesting kind of take in storytelling and narrative. It's very tightly done, and she was very talented at that. Even with her shorts, you know, the narrative is they're always quite playful. There's always quite a lot of comedy in them, and yeah, they kind of rock it along at a good pace. She was good at that. But I think you're right. A lot of that comes down to process and having to be very, very organised and yeah.
I think it also speaks to its sort of folkloric and fairy tale nature. Fairy tales are incredibly economical because they need to be told out loud from memory. Once upon a time in a faraway kingdom, there was a wicked queen and a handsome prince. Well, we've done characterization, we've done first act, and we haven't got to the end of the first sentence. I think J.R.R. Tolkien takes 3 chapters to explain how Frodo sets his house in order before he leaves the Shire. Folk stories get to the point because they're there to be told and retold and remembered. So I think there's a certain element of that going on as well, which makes it such a sort of great thing for early animation to exploit, because the story is so slight but so sort of rife for visualization at the same time. So great comment. Thanks. On the front row we had a question, I think. On the front row we had a question.
Thank you. I think the German issue is really important in terms of this film because, for example, what I found a number of things interesting. The race issue obviously is fascinating because the African sorcerer had a huge hooked nose and he was always seen grabbing bags of money, which was very typical of Germany at the time because the whole demonization of Jews, and you look at the history of the Rothschilds, etc. And the other point I was going to make was that I feel this is probably why she's been marginalized and buried to a greater extent, because the Americans, obviously, it wasn't in their interest, particularly at the time, to celebrate a German. So a lot of European things were buried at the time and misrepresented in order to promote the American perception of the victorious and the primary, really. Would you agree with that?
Possibly, although I mean, quite a few German filmmakers did move to Hollywood during the 20s and the 30s, particularly in the 30s. So, I mean, lots of people cite film noir.
But they were Americanized. They were perceived, the German directors and all those people were actually seen as American rather than German.
Right.
Although I suppose, but one of the features of film noir is obviously the expressionist lighting. So
Yes.
what's weird is that there's that paradox going on. If you're saying that they're Americanized, whilst at the same time being celebrated for qualities in their film that are being traced back to Germany.
Yes.
So they can't be perhaps fully Americanized if, or maybe there's a slippage.
By the general public, I mean.
Right,
sort of Americanized, not in terms of the techniques they use, whereas she was very much German. Perceived as German, if you see what I mean.
Well, she left Germany with the rise of Nazism, but she spent she moved to Europe. So she did spend quite a lot of time here. She spent time all around Europe and never really went back to Germany to settle. She went back to visit her mum when she was ill and dying, but never really went back to settle there. She spent quite a lot of time in Canada doing workshops, animation workshops there. So I don't think I can speak to how she was seen in that respect, but I think we do have to remember that she did leave Germany in protest.
I do understand, but a lot of amazing German artists were actually tarred with the same brush at the time, even though they did leave. And they did rebel politically against the horror, but they were seen as, they were marginalised for being German and for being associated with...
And that potentially sort of, therefore, might have echoed into...
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, not so much in England, which, as I said, had, you had the Mitfords and all sorts of connections which were very friendly to the Nazi regime, but with the Americans, that was seen as very, very much verboten, if you will, and sort of not acceptable. Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks for the comment. Absolutely.
Hi, thank you very much for playing the film. I really enjoyed it. I guess maybe continuing from the first guy's comment, and with respect to what you were saying about how her reputation is perhaps lessened by her being seen as like a craftsman rather than like an artist, or some sort of tension between those two. But I actually personally think that that's a false tension, because this film, I thought, was something of a masterpiece in visual storytelling. And I thought the visual storytelling was massively down to the detail she put into and the beauty in which she created this amazing world. And so I feel like, I don't really know anything about this period of film or her as an auteur, but just from my experience with this film, you can clearly see that there's a fantastic relationship between her as a craftsman and then her ability to tell the story, because essentially the story is driven by the amazing world she creates. And then one other thing which I perhaps want to add is you mentioned about her amazing use of metamorphosis between the characters, and perhaps that was something which came out of her use of negative space, because the characters are all negative space, then things can emerge from the darkness. And you mentioned that this negative space became maybe something of an anachronism because it was something which was pinned to children's storytelling and stuff like that. And again, it may be certain technologies die out, and then, because of the emergence of photography, etc., and color and blah, 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 then it got sort of buried, whereas actually maybe we just essentially lost an amazing craft. But yeah, I really enjoyed it, and maybe you could discuss her use of her craft to tell the story, because I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a masterpiece as well. So my whole work is around, recovering that, and the work that I've been doing recently is about craft and how important it is in terms of storytelling, and this sort of amazing work that's out there. So I completely agree with you. It is a masterpiece and it's a very important film. My argument is that that's not represented in how she's been written about in either the trade press, critics' reviews, or in film scholarly work. And that's what my issue is with it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, but that needs to be represented in how we talk about these kinds of films. Yeah, I don't know where's the mic.
I have nothing insightful to add to that, but that was an insightful comment.
Hi guys, thank you very much for a lovely film and a lovely evening. I do have two questions. So the first question is, I was hoping, Caroline, you could speak more to her process and how she actually creates the cutouts, because the entire time I was looking at some of the lace work and thinking, that's an X-Acto knife. She didn't have an X-Acto knife. What did she use to create? Because the only thing I can think of is like when you do a snowflake as a kid, and you fold it up, but then there's no creases. So it's just, I guess that speaks to how well she makes this, but also it's kind of magical. Sorry.
No, it is, yeah.
So that's the first question. And the second question, too, would be, what are the odds that this would have any sort of influence on Walt Disney? Because in the music, I swore I heard just an echo of Elephants on Parade. So that was an odd thing where I was like, no, wait a second, this isn't Dumbo. So yeah, just maybe, we know this precedes Disney by a long shot, but again, would it have reached him in any sense, and maybe to what extent, if you guys could speak to any of that?
Thank you. Yeah, they're really good questions. So what she did is she just had a series of tools, mostly tiny scissors, and those kinds of little knives. You can see them in the museum in Tübingen, which is a dedicated permanent exhibition to Lotte Reiniger. So you can see her tools. And if you look up, you can watch it on YouTube, I think. How she did it is she never moves the scissors, she just moves the paper. So it's a very skilled way of working, and obviously it's very detailed and intricate, but that is all she used, is a number of small scissors and knives, and a very kind of incredible way of kind of being able to move her hands. And the Disney thing is, it's a really good question. So she obviously started making this film in 1923, and it took her 3 years to make it, and it was either shortly before that or during that time that she built the table. And of course, there were many tables that she built over the years, which created these layers, which you can. I know it's a very flat 2D film, but there are moments where you can see that kind of depth of field start to come through. So, yeah, the only thing I can say is that I found a note in an archive that Walt Disney visited her in shortly after 1926, which would mean he probably saw the film and probably saw her table.
And didn't do anything with that information?
No.
Crucially?
Didn't copy it at all.
Yeah. Forgot it entirely
Yeah.
and then invented a remarkably similar machine a few years later. I think the phrase deeply problematic is going to be used again in a minute, yeah.
So there is evidence in an archive.
It's a note written by a family member on a letter, and that's all we've got. And I'm still trying to corroborate that. Wow. Yeah, I know. Wow. It was a shivers down the spine moment, I can tell you. But yeah, so I think it's likely that either he would have seen the film at some point. That's a good 10-year gap between. And it did have releases in America. So I'm sure he would have seen the film. It also seems likely that he did go to see her, and in which case he would have seen the table, but I don't have much evidence of that other than a handwritten note from an archive. But whatever you say, if you look at Walt Disney's multi-plane cameras, is incredible. But if you put the images next to each other, it's exactly the same design. And that might be coincidence, but I don't think it is.
But it might not.
I think we've got, I think we're two hands. Yeah, one here and one here. So
we've got time for one more question.
Okay.
Why don't we take the final two and we'll see if we can sort of fold them into one omni answer, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so one at the front and then a gentleman at the back, yeah.
Well, thank you for the movie. I mean, it was wonderful to see it on the screen here. So I guess kind of riding off of what we've been talking about, especially when it comes to coverage for Lotte Reiniger. So how did the distribution of this film, The Adventures of Prince Achmed, compare to the distribution of Snow White, and has that influenced the way that this film or these two films have been written in history at all, like on a national scale and on an international scale?
So obviously Reiniger's film had a much more limited release than... I don't know much about this. Chris will know more about it. So you will know more about this Snow White release.
That Chris will.
Both Chris's will be able to talk about that. But
for the benefit of those listeners at home in a few months, they're both pointing at Chris Pallant, who is an academic sitting at the back who answered the first question. I thought I'd be the voice of the listener at home going, who the hell are you talking about? And who is this Chris?
Sorry. I keep forgetting, and this is for a podcast.
It's an audio medium.
Radio.
Yeah. So the Reiniger release was, as we would see now, with a fairly independent film. It was a slow run, so it got released in Germany to a very small number of theatres, and then was kind of rolled out. So it had a slow, long release, which is what we would see now, pretty much, with a film of that description, which means it kind of builds. Word of mouth gets around and it builds a reputation that way, just like a film would on a film festival circuit. Whereas, I don't know about Snow White. Did it have a big wide release?
Pretty wide release, yeah.
So it's your traditional box office hit versus a smaller film festival kind of rollout. Although this is before the days of film festivals. Yeah. So she played very much to her own kind of artistic crowd initially, and then it kind of got rolled out.
And then we've got time for the last quick question, which is just at the back.
It's just a really quick question regarding shadow puppetry. We heard about a puppet show in southern Thailand, which we attended. It was the grandfather of the gentleman that actually showed us the show, and the whole of the kind of range of kind of figures actually are almost a carbon copy of these Thai mystical creatures, which all seem to have a great deal of depth within their own culture. And I just wondered if from Potsdam 23, what sort of a relationship would the author have, if any, with Thailand?
With Thailand specifically, I don't know, but she was fascinated by shadow puppetry and wrote books about it, in fact. So she, being a child, she would make her own shadow puppet theatres, which you're absolutely right. You can see the influence of that in the film. And she was, the fact that she based this film on 1001 Nights, she was very preoccupied with Middle Eastern folklore and fairy tales and South Asian folklore as well. So yeah, there's clearly a relationship there. I don't know where that came from. As far as I know, she never visited any of those regions, but it's very clear. It's very clearly an influence in her work, and she writes about it as well as it's obvious in the visuals as well. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, as I said, everybody, for sticking around. Please do join me in thanking Caroline for sharing her wonderful thoughts on Reiniger.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. I enjoyed it. Did you, Chris?
I liked the fact that we had some long-time listeners, first-time kind of people involved who've listened to us over the last few months and then kind of came along and wanted to be part of our kind of conversation as we took the discussion on, or Caroline as well, took the discussion on Reiniger from women to her connections to Germany and German national identity. So we covered a lot in a short space of time. So I'm grateful to Caroline and for the people that came along, that engaged with the film, loved the film. I think it was well received when we watched it, and people kind of clapping along. And I think it's a great movie and is rightly held up as this seminal landmark film within animation. We do.
We'll leave you with that. If you enjoyed listening to that and want to be part of the live conversations,
hear yourself on this podcast, asking a question.
Contribute, ask a question, get involved in the conversation physically in the room with us. We still have tickets left for all our screenings in 2020. In a week or so, you can come watch Wizards, the Ralph Bakshi high fantasy movie. It's a bonkers classic. I really would recommend it. Tickets are selling well for that, but we could always have a few more people in the room.
Then we've got Dark Crystal, one of your...
So excited about Dark Crystal. February, remind me of the date?
February the 20-something.
February the 20-something.
As he frantically looks at his diary, this bit will be cut out.
I don't know if it will.
I was right. I was going to say, okay. February the 28th.
February the 28th. The Jim Henson Puppet Classic, come watch it. And maybe you've watched the new Netflix series and are now dripping in nostalgia. Come down, see it gloriously projected at the Cinema Museum, and then listen to us and a special guest who is not quite confirmed yet, but I'm hoping it's going to be an exciting one.
And then at the end of March, so we'll be doing on Friday the 27th of March, we'll be doing actually a film that we've already done on the podcast. So do listen to the podcast and come along. And that is Yellow Submarine, where we have a special guest, Jing An Young, playwright, academic, who will come and talk to us about the 60s context out of which Yellow Submarine emerged. So if you're interested in fantasy animation, you're interested in us chatter about all things animated fantasy, do come along to the Cinema Museum throughout January, February and March, and we'd love to see you.
Some of these will be released as live episodes later on in the year, but not yet, so come down and listen to them live and take part. Tickets are available on the Cinema Museum website. That's cinemamuseum.org.uk. Click on the events tab and you'll be able to find us on that.
Or you can visit the Fantasy Animation website, and there's a particular tab, the Cinema Museum series. Click on that and it gives you all the information about the films that we've already screened, films that we're going to screen, and links where you can buy tickets.
And what is that website, Chris?
That is fantasy-animation.org.
Great. You can find us there. You can find us on Twitter at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research, as well as on Facebook and on our Phantom Instagram account that doesn't exist yet, but keep saying it might appear. It's like Peter Pan, clap your hands if you believe in Instagram. We will become modern and trendy, we promise, at some point.
Speak for yourself.
Give us a like. Subscribe on your various podcast feeds. Give us a quick review if you can and a star rating. All of this helps find a friend who you don't like quite as much as the rest of them and make them download the podcast and listen to it. All of it really helps help those numbers keep growing. Thanks very much. We've been Fantasy Animation.
Bye.